The sound of hatred rings through the streets of the German capital, Berlin, as anti-Islam rallies pass through its streets. The march, organized by the far-right patriotic Europeans against the Islamization of the West, signals that a new wave of Islamophobic sentiment is sweeping across Europe. The rallies come in the wake of the Paris attacks, but on the other side of town, the Muslim community has clearly denounced the terrorist operation in the French capital and is fighting back. Counter-protests were held to refute claims that Islam was connected to terrorism. And to further rebuke the growing German anti-Islamic movement, Chancellor Angela Merkel, who joined those anti-Islamophobia rallies, earlier denounced violence in the name of religion.
We must note that there are hate preachers. There are violent people who abuse religion for their agenda. The terrible events of Paris are a sad example for this. What we need to do now is to use all the means at our disposal as a constitutional state to combat intolerance and violence.
But the anti-Islamic sentiment is by no means exclusive to Germany. In next-door Switzerland, activists have founded a local branch of the German anti-Islam movement and plan to hold a rally of their own next month. Back in Paris, multiple reports of attacks on mosques has raised fears among French Muslims.
Nothing can justify that we can hate or kill people just because they don't agree with you. So I was very sad, very angry, and shocked. But I think that the worst is in front of us, and I'm particularly afraid about the Muslim community because they are vulnerable in this country.
Many Muslims like Majdid believe that Western leaders just don't want them there.
The problem is not that they can't, they don't want. They don't want to make the difference. They use what happened 3 days ago to develop their political purpose, which is to expel Muslim people from France. And I think that this is in the head of many French people in this country. So even if they know that there's not any link between Islam and what happened, it's so easy to make it that they do it on purpose to ensure that people will live in the fear of this religion.
Whether Western leaders are intentionally working to ostracize the Muslim community is an open question. What is clear is that their foreign and domestic policy has given way to radical far-right movements to raise their voices against Islam.
All right, let's now speak to Dan Glazebrook. He is a London-based journalist. Dan, knowing that these anti-Islam protests took hold before the Paris attacks, why are we seeing increasing hatred towards Muslims in Europe?
Well, you're absolutely right. There is this hatred, and I think it's being deliberately stoked, I think. I mean, there are so many parallels between what's happening now to the Muslim community and what was happening in the 1930s to the Jewish community. It's quite troubling. I mean, the famous incident of Kristallnacht in Nazi Germany was actually preceded by a attack, a murder actually by a Jewish man in Paris, in fact, on the German ambassador in Paris. And then Kristallnacht, when the Jewish businesses and shops were destroyed and hundreds of Jews were killed, this was a reaction, an anti-Semitic reaction against this so-called act of terrorism that took place in France. So it's quite unnerving, the parallels now that again we have an act of terrorism in France, and that's fueling this kind of Islamophobic reaction in Berlin. But at the same time, I think it's important to note that the Western governments have been very, very two-faced about this, at least two-faced, in fact, because they're promoting the so-called Islamists, terrorist sort of death squads in Syria, in Libya. The very day of the attack in France, there was a huge attack in Nigeria by Boko Haram. No less than the UN have made it very clear. A report by the UN in January 2012 said that the rise of Boko Haram is definitively and clearly attributable to NATO's war against Libya, which turned Libya into a safe haven for these kind of grounds, gave them access to all of Gaddafi's weaponry, and directly armed, trained, and fund them as well. And the same thing's been happening in Syria. So the West is promoting and fueling these kind of death squads that go and do their business under the name of Islam. So they shouldn't be surprised when these things spill over onto their own borders as well. If they're really concerned about extremism, they need to stop funding it around the rest of the world.
It's interesting that you mentioned how the Jews really suffered hatred in the 1930s, when now you are seeing Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu actually promoting this anti-Islamist sentiment. Yeah, well, quite well, exactly. I mean, a lot of people's analysis in the West of fascism is quite simplistic, and it thinks, you know, fascism has to be anti-Jewish. It doesn't have to be anti-Jewish. It can be pro-Jewish supremacy. It can be pro-Israeli. And actually the modern form of fascism often is. We see the fascist movements in this country, in Britain, often waving Israeli flags. The loyalist movement in Northern Ireland would always, and still do, have their Israeli flags out of the window to show that they're on the side of basically of white supremacy, which is what Israel is. So there's nothing specific. There's no reason fascism has to be anti-Semitic in the current climate. Muslims have play the same kind of role within modern fascist ideology as Jews did in the 1930s, the kind of demonized minority that actually represent the kind of middle class sphere, both of the poor, because a lot of poor communities are Muslim communities around Europe, and of the rich, because people feel like, oh, you know, the kind of wealthy Arabs buying up London and so on, they're also Muslims. So the Muslim stands for this kind of middle class sphere of both the poor and the rich, just as the Jew figure of the Jew did in the 1930s. So it plays a very similar function, I think, Islamophobia today as anti-Semitism did in the 1930s. And of course, the ruling classes in Europe are playing both sides. I've already mentioned they're supporting the death squads that go under the name of Islam in Libya, Syria, Nigeria, Iraq, and so on. And they're also supporting in Ukraine openly fascist groups. They're supporting fascist militias in Ukraine. They've encouraged the Ukrainian government to use fascist militias to wage war on the ethnic Russian population in their own country. So they're stoking both sides of this extremism. So they're, like I say, they're being at least two-faced when they claim, like Merkel did today, to be against kind of Islamophobic fascism and against Islamic extremism. They're promoting both in their foreign policy very, very clearly. So can leaders like Chancellor Merkel or President Hollande, when they go out in these rallies, really cast away blame for their government's contribution to this Islamist militancy, or death squads, as you put it there?
Well, unfortunately, they can, because their populations are still remain, unfortunately, largely ignorant and still too ready and too quick to blame the kind of the perpetrators of the kind of violence we've seen, rather than that the powers and forces behind them. Of course, it's right on one hand to blame the perpetrators. I'm not going to justify any of the actions taken by the kind of death squads in their manifestation in Paris or anywhere else. But it's important to see who's facilitating them, who's training them, who's arming them. And it's the Western countries and their allies in Saudi Arabia and so on that are behind the rise of these movements, that have paid for their training in Syria and Libya, armed them, equipped them, given them propaganda cover, calling them freedom fighters against dictatorships and so on and so forth. So really, and it's very sad actually to see Western populations actually falling into the trap of supporting moves to give intelligence and security services more powers. The very intelligence services that are actually coordinating and facilitating these death squads in the Middle East, they're actually now being kind of duped into allowing them to have even more power, thinking that that's somehow going to prevent what's happening. It's not, because we've seen MI5, MI6 directly involved, the SAS as well, directly involved in coordinating these kind of terror groups across the Middle East. How is it going to help exactly to give these services even more powers? It's not. It's going to just try and, they want to use these powers to streamline their operations, make them more efficient and more effective. It's not actually going to aid anything. The only thing that will prevent these kind of terror attacks on the streets of the West, of Western cities and Europe, is if Europe stops promoting them in the rest of the world.
All right, London-based journalist Dan Glazebrook, thank you for speaking to Ali Tujar.
Thank you.